Good morning, English majors. Today we're talking about W.B. Yeats.
No, Y-E-A-T-S, Yeats. Rhymes with Keats.
Yeats, William Butler Yeats, apparently. We're going to be talking about three poems of his. A little bit about this guy before we jump in. We are in the modernist period. Last time we talked about Thomas Hardy. Today we are going into Yeats. Few things, if you remember what I said last time about modernism, you can think of the period as being marked by a loss of faith to some extent. And this isn't true of every single poet, this isn't true of every single artist, but these are general trends. Loss of faith in what? Loss of faith in God. Okay, this is going to be very important for Yeats. Loss of faith in Christianity. He's going to try to recover a new religion. We'll get into that. Loss of faith in God, loss of faith in Western civilization, and loss of faith in beauty. Now, Yeats never loses faith in beauty. In fact, that's where he wants to found his whole religion on art, on culture, and that sort of thing. So Yeats is one of the huge time poets. He gives us the poem from which we get the line, "No Country for Old Men," which you might know from the book, "No Country for Old Men," which you might know from the movie, "No Country for Old Men."
You need to call it. I can't call it for you. Well, it wouldn't be fair.
I didn't put nothing up.
Yes, you did. You've been putting it up your whole life. You just didn't know it.
So, Yeats. We're going to be looking at three poems. His poetic career can sort of be thought to have two halves. In the beginning, when he first starts writing in the late 1800s, he is very much going back to the Romantics. He's interested in sort of the Irish folklore. He is Irish. He spends 6 years of his childhood in London, but he's born in Ireland and moves back to Ireland after those years in London. So he's interested in Irish folklore. He's interested in sort of the mysticism of it. We'll see that in a poem in just a second. After this period of sort of an interest in folklore, an interest in the romantic things, which are what? Like nature, beauty for beauty's sake. So he's got an elegiac tone, okay? Elegy is mournful often. There's this sense of loss. We're going to look for that in our first poem. And then he'll turn sort of mid-career into the poetry that the people these days are more interested in, which you might call, what would you call it? It's almost occult-like. Talking about poems like Lapis Lazuli. I'm talking about poems like The Second Coming, which we'll be looking at together here. So let's jump into that first poem. The first poem I want to read together is called The Song of Wandering Aengus. You can see it's written in 1899, so this would be, if you want to split his career into two parts, this would be firmly in the first part. This is, again, romantic. It's folklorish. It's beautiful. Why don't I read it for us? I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. And when I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame. But something rustled on the floor and something called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering, through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips, and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done, the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. So you can see where what are these silver apples of the moon you're talking about? What are these golden apples of the sun? Why should a fish change into a girl? This is the stuff of folklore. There's no why here. It's just a nice story. It's beautiful. It's strange. I mentioned elegy. Elegy was originally sort of a lament for the dead, for someone who was lost. What gets lost here? Well, he's caught this fish, but the fish turns out to be a girl, and a beautiful, captivating girl. But then she runs away. So there's a sense of desire deferred here. A sense of sadness sort of pervades. If you ever read the good old folklore stuff, the good old fairy tales, there is this sort of sense of a time past, a time lost, a time that once was beautiful and won't be recovered, or maybe someday, but not now. Yeats says himself that he made a new religion, almost an infallible church of poetic tradition. So he wants to, he knows that Christianity is no longer believable, and he wants to reach into this sort of mythic Anglo-Irish past to get something more, to replace religion. Now, and that's the thing about religion, is that, if these days you might look at at Western Europe, you might look at America, and you might see a trend of secularization. Indeed, this is true. Did you know that there are now more religious people, more Christians, more Muslims than there have ever been in history? And that's not just because there's more people, it's also true by percentage of population. There are more Christians and Muslims than there have ever been at any point in history. Google it, I dare you. 50 years ago, people like, say, Carl Sagan were talking about how, we have moved, in America, we've moved beyond the religious period. Now we're entering a secular era. People don't really talk like that anymore, because if you look at countries like South Korea, if you look at countries like China or the continent of Africa, the trend is not in that direction. It's in fact in the other. Why am I bringing this up? Because this speaks to an important quality, I think, of human nature, is that people are by nature religious. I want to assert. And this is certainly the case for Yeats. He is cognitively, he's aware of his need for religion. He thinks that Christianity won't do any longer. He wants to get it elsewhere, but nowhere does he deny that, nowhere is he irreligious. In fact, as his life goes on, he'll get outright occultish. He's doing automatic writing. What's automatic writing? It's writing with something called a planchette, often. What's a planchette? Okay, a Ouija board, right? You sort of put your hands on it and move the thing around. Well, you put a pencil on like that little Ouija controller thing, and you do this, and doodles and words come out, and these doodles and words are like the spirits speaking through you, or at least that's what Yeats thought. So this is something he would actually do. Okay, this was like a heads up, deliberate, like, oh yeah, he says, the spirits speak through me. Of course they do. Like, where do you think poetry comes from? Side note, footnote. Interesting idea, by the way. So many artists, especially the Romanticists, do you remember the Aeolian harp? The Aeolian harp of Romanticism? An Aeolian harp is one that's just set outside and the wind blows through the chords and the strings, and it plays music. It's this sort of effortless poetry, this effortless music that the wind, the spirit, Aeolus, the spirit of the wind, plays the Aeolian harp. Okay. Even David Lynch, do you know who David Lynch is? The guy who did Twin Peaks, and he does a lot of other weird stuff, and he's awesome. David Lynch uses the metaphor of radio signals. If you look at his stuff so frequently, like he uses the buzz, the hiss of like a radio station that's not quite being picked up right. This is like a theme for him. Okay, so same idea, same idea. He's just picking up like the waves from the universe, and he's just an implement of these signals he's getting from elsewhere as an artist. Okay, so this idea is old. We see Yeats participating in it. This idea of sort of ideas from elsewhere, spirit speaking through me, and this goes all the way back to the Greek, the vates, the poets who sort of have this vatic furor. They just get in these states, and then just art just comes out of them as if they're possessed or something. Okay, well, so much for Wandering Aengus. So what I want to do now is talk about the transition. Well, all this beautiful elegiac poetry of Yeats apparently wasn't enough for him. Okay, he's going to want something deeper, something, dare I say, darker. And he really goes through sort of a personal, even sort of a national revolution around the year 1916. So what happens in 1916? Again, Yeats is Irish, and in Easter 1916, there's this uprising that lasts for 6 days. Yeats is actually back in England at this time. And he sees this uprising, and it's put down. It's a uprising. What is it? It's a rebellion of the Irish against the English. The Irish see themselves as occupied by England. Indeed, a few years later, 1922, they're going to, much of Ireland is going to become its own country, the Republic of Ireland, which it is to this day. But it's complicated because Northern Ireland, so the Republic of Ireland is mainly Catholic. Northern Ireland is mainly Protestant and elected to stay within the UK, the British system. So now you have an island that's sort of like got this UK foothold, but that might sound, well, if you're Irish, you don't like that at all. Coming from my perspective, it's like, well, the people in Northern Ireland want to be in the UK. It's their choice, but the people in Southern Ireland, the people in the Republic of Ireland really resent that. Okay. Well, so this uprising happens, and it's put down. It's. Would you say it's a failure? If within though the Irish don't defeat the English militarily, they get many of their wishes granted. That they get what they want to an extent just a few years later. So was it a failure? Well, Yeats sees this Easter Rebellion as a dignifying tragedy, and it sort of re-inflames his love of Irish culture. He was very disenchanted with the middle class in Ireland because he felt like his art wasn't getting through to them the way he felt like he wasn't being heard in the way he meant to be. He should have been heard. Well, it's around this period that he writes this short little poem called A Coat. The second poem I'm going to read for you. A Coat. I made my song a coat, covered with embroideries, out of old mythologies from heel to throat, but the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eyes, as though they'd wrought it. Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked. What's going on here? The coat. You remember Thomas Carlyle and Sartor Resartus? Remember what Sartor means in Latin? It means clothes. The clothier reclothed. The clothes maker reclothed. That's what this is about. His one style is like a jacket that he used to wear. Which style? This romantic style that he, all the cultural artistic efforts up to this point, he felt like that he had put on himself were being misunderstood. The fools caught it, they grabbed it, and he just slips out of it and says, you know what? I'm just going to walk around naked. I'm going to be who I really am now. You take that old coat, I don't need it anymore. I'm going to shift from that kind of poetry, which you didn't understand anyway, to this new set of things. Now, this shift that he makes, has often been thought of this huge cosmic change in who he was and in the kind of poetry he was trying to write. But the scholar Langdon Hammer sort of sees him as really all he's doing is changing one set of symbols for another one. Okay, so he starts with the sort of Irish folklore elegy to this, what would you even call his new style? He's interested in the Spiritus Mundi, which literally translates the spirit of the world, which you can sort of understand again in Hammer's words as a repertoire of archetypes. What's an archetype? Types of characters that you know. Okay, the knight in shining armor, the mustache twirling villain, the damsel in distress, the dragon, who is, what do we know about dragons? They're greedy, they're rapacious, they're a threat, they're venomous. Okay, they breathe fire. All these tropes he saw in culture as sort of existing in maybe the oversoul or the collective imagination of the world, which is culture. Culture is a repository of all these different things. And these are away from sort of the Irish, strictly Anglo-Irish folklore and into sort of a more shared, what he sees as universal human set of symbols. What am I talking about? Let's take a look. To understand this, we're going to look at the second coming. Okay, this is one of my favorite poems. Let's take a look. The second coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. Pause. You know what a widening gyre is? That's a widening gyre. You see how right in the middle here, this is where you start. Now, the image he's going to start with, and we'll go back to the poem in a second. We'll start over. But the image Yeats is giving us is of a falcon. Okay, this is a bird's eye view. So imagine that right here in the middle, there's a falconer. Okay, the falconer lets the falcon go and he flies around in a circle. And for Yeats, he wants to use this widening gyre. Okay, he's going to circle out farther and farther and farther until what? Until he can't hear the falconer anymore. The center cannot hold. The falcon has gotten so far away from his center that he is sort of lost in the atmosphere now. He's got no centripetal force. He's got nothing pushing him back to a defined center. This is a problem for Yeats. Again, he doesn't want to move to an atheistic, freewheeling state of humanity. Okay, which is where most secular people, frankly, don't most secular people want to? Don't they enjoy their freedom? Don't they want to self-determine? Okay. Self-identify is a term that has been used more and more these days. Okay, I identify. I choose my identity. On one hand, isn't that freeing? And see the postmodernists for all this, Sartre especially. On one hand, isn't that absolute liberty? On the other hand, isn't that absolutely lost if you have nothing holding you together holding you down to anything? Your identity is wholly self-generated. Whence culture? Whence God? Where does God fit in to this? If he's no longer the source of your identity, if culture is no longer the source of your identity, what responsibilities can you hold others to? What responsibility can they hold you to if all meaning and responsibility are defined by each and every individual? This is a problem, and Yeats perceived it to be a problem. Okay, so widening gyre, getting away from all the traditions, habits of religion. A religion he doesn't want, to be clear, again. It sounds like I'm making a defense of Christianity here. That's not the way Yeats saw it. Let's continue. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Woo! Fiery stuff. Love it. Love it. Now, why do I love this so much? That's a question worth asking. This is disastrous. This rough beast, this pagan god that he's describing, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I mean, from a Christian perspective, geez, this sounds like an antichrist or something like that, doesn't it? Well, one philosopher you ought to understand if you want to really get Yeats is, in my opinion, the atheist philosopher par excellence, and that is who but Friedrich Nietzsche. In 1902, W.B. Yeats gets a hold of a book of Nietzsche's and loves it. So, what is Nietzsche? What's so great about Nietzsche in Yeats's eyes? Well, Nietzsche has this idea of tragic joy. Tragic joy. Okay. Back to that Easter Rebellion in 1916, tragic joy. When that happened, Yeats apparently found it attractive. There was this dignity now that the Irish had gotten by fighting for their freedom, by even in their loss, it was a beautiful loss. Okay, so there's this idea of a tragic joy. The scholar Jehan Ramazani puts it this way. I'm going to quote him. Yeats's poems of tragic joy are his most familiar and controversial achievement. Okay, we're talking about poems like The Second Coming. They're his most familiar and controversial since all potentially encode affirmative responses to death and destruction. Okay, what does encode mean? Forget that. What Ramazani is saying is that they're controversial. Isn't it weird that we should be reading and that I should be getting all excited about a poem that seems to invite and desire death and destruction? That I'm getting a kick right now out of this widening gyre. I'm responding to it in some way as a reader. To this, again, what Ramazani is going to call a meditation on the brink of calamity. Meditation on the brink of calamity. It's the apocalypse seems to be coming. And by the way, apocalypse is not a bad word for this. In Yeats's worldview, he's writing at the beginning of the 20th century. It's the time is revolving. That's a big, nice round number. And his idea is that Christianity has had its 2,000 years, and now this new thing slouches toward Bethlehem. Something else is going to come and be born into Bethlehem. And this thing is this terrible sphinx. It troubles his gaze. This is a horrible thing. And yet there is this sense of delight. I think we can read into this poem. This gets into Yeats's idea of terrible beauty. In the poem that Yeats writes, called Easter 1916. The refrain is about terrible beauty. Okay, so the nice, again, remember that Aengus poem? This nice, beautiful elegiac poetry, this romantic poetry. Well, it is nice. It is beautiful. I love that poem. But Yeats needs something more, and maybe I do too. Yeats seems to need, just the sense of loss is not enough to capture his whole self, his whole artistic, poetic, religious self. He needs some sort of apocalypse, some sort of, dare I say, judgment. Don't you know? Wherever your background you're coming from, don't you know that the world is a broken place? Don't you know the world has broken people in it? Don't you despise Hitler? Don't you know that there are evil people in the world, people the world would be a better place if we could just take them out of it? Okay. Doesn't there need to be some sort of reckoning? Surely some revelation is at hand. It doesn't use the word reckoning, doesn't use the word judgment, but to me those themes do seem to be sort of baked in here. Again, Nietzsche. Ramazani quotes Nietzsche and he says this. In the quote, I'll tell you when the quote starts. But as we're watching, as the reader is watching these poetic expressions of doom, Nietzsche says this: a metaphysical solace momentarily lifts us above the whirl of shifting phenomena. A metaphysical solace momentarily lifts us above the whirl of shifting phenomena. We're in sort of the eye of the storm, and for just a minute, there's this solace, this comfort, metaphysical, philosophical. I would say, and Yeats might say, spiritual solace. Why? Because you get what you stinking deserve. Okay? Because justice is being handed out. Did you know, and this is, by the way, Williams Baptist University students, this is biblical. Some of it. I want to be super careful about that. I'm not celebrating the coming of the Antichrist. But when was the last time you read Revelation? Did you know? Do you recall? There's a point in the book of Revelation, if we're on the subject of apocalyptic literature, and we are, there's a point in which the whore of Babylon is thrown into the bottomless pit, okay? And she's burned there, okay, in the lake of fire. She's thrown into the lake of fire. And the smoke of this burning rises all the way up to heaven. And you might say, that sounds pretty awful. Like, let's get the hell smoke is in heaven? That sounds awful. There are two smells that get described, two heavenly smells, a lot of visuals you get, and there's two smells that I can find of heaven in the book of Revelation. One is in the censer of God. It is the prayers of the saints, and this has a heavenly aroma. Your prayers, saints, have a heavenly aroma to God, if you believe the Bible, which I do. And the second smell is this smoke from the whore of Babylon. Okay, it smokes forever. The verse says this: once more they cried out. Who are they? The saved souls in heaven. Once more they cried out, "Hallelujah! The smoke from her goes up forever and ever." In Revelation, in the Bible itself, there is this tragic joy. Now, the saints can be happy because it's not them. It's somebody else. It's not us. It's not me who's being burned. It's somebody else. And you might say, I hope that there's a twinge. I hope that you're getting a little bit of cognitive dissonance here. Well, that doesn't sound like love at all, does it? Doesn't it sound like justice? Look, here's the thing. Hitler, if somebody threw Hitler into one of the ovens he was using to kill, to commit genocide, against the Jews of Europe. Somebody threw him into one of those. Wouldn't that be justice? If you don't think that's justice, what is justice? Now imagine the smell. Imagine those 6 million Jews who had been killed in the Holocaust, now smelling Hitler burning in one of the furnaces that he had used. There's a certain sense of justice there. Leviticus 1:9 says that the burnt offerings, okay? The idea is that the sin of the world goes on these offerings. The burnt offerings are a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So, that's a way into thinking about this tragic joy that we see in this poem without being a total monster. Because who wants to invite suffering? Who wants to invite this rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouching toward Bethlehem, unless there's some sort of justice in it? Now, I'm sort of reading against the grain here. But Yeats, I do think it's fair to say there is an ambivalence here. There is an enjoyment in the blood-dimmed tide, I think, even for Yeats, the non-Christian. I do detect that. Even as he says that he is vexed to nightmare, even as he says that the spiritus mundi troubles his sight. It is troubling. He tells us that in the poet. But isn't there don't you detect a tragic beauty here? So that is the tragic beauty of Yeats. His visions, I think, are fascinating. And indeed, not just fascinating, correct. He's writing this all before Hitler came into power, before Stalin came into power, who killed more people than Hitler, more of his own people than Hitler, before Mao Zedong came into power, who killed more people than Stalin, who killed more people than Hitler. I'm talking about just in terms of liquidating their own populations, let alone others. So, what is this rough beast? Was it fascism? Was it communism? What replaced religion? What replaced Christianity? Was it the religion of fascism? What is it the religion of communism? Maybe. All right, folks, I'll leave you there. Take care. We'll see you next time.